If you haven't heard part 1, go back and listen first. Because what I am about to tell you will not make complete sense without it. For everyone who has been waiting, thank you. I felt every single comment. Every message. Every person who said they knew exactly how this felt. This one is for you. When we left off, I had just watched my CEO present my entire strategy to 200 people. My 18 months of work. My research. My financial models. My framework. Under a different name. Without a single mention of mine. I had driven home. Made coffee. Opened a folder on my desktop and named it evidence. And then I got to work. I want to be very clear about something before I continue. What I did next was not driven by anger. Anger had been there in the beginning, loud and hot and almost impossible to think past. But by the time I sat down at that kitchen table, the anger had done something unexpected. It had become very, very quiet. And in that quiet I was able to think with a precision I had never quite accessed before. The first thing I did was compile a complete timeline. Every document I had created for Project Lantern. Every version. Every timestamp. Going all the way back to the first rough notes I had made 14 months before I ever presented it to Richard. I had been meticulous in my work, always had been, and that meticulousness was now the most important thing I owned. Next I went through every email between Richard and me from the past 18 months. I printed them all. I highlighted every instance where I had referenced Project Lantern. Every attachment. Every follow-up question he had asked me about specific details of the framework. Then I did something that turned my stomach. I went through the company's public communications from the past 3 months. Press releases. Internal announcements. The CEO's LinkedIn posts. Project Beacon had been mentioned publicly 4 times before that all-hands meeting. 4 times. While I was still sitting at my desk 2 floors below, still believing that Richard was quietly finding the right moment to bring my work to the executive team. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I made a list of every person who had known about Project Lantern before that meeting. It was a short list. Richard. My direct colleague Maya, who I had bounced early ideas off one evening over dinner. And one other person. Someone I had not thought about in months. 8 months before I presented to Richard, I had attended an external strategy workshop. A 2-day event. On the second afternoon I had ended up in a small group discussion with a woman named Claire. She worked at a consulting firm that, I now remembered with a coldness spreading through my chest, had a retainer contract with my company. In that discussion I had talked about the early framework of what would become Project Lantern. Not in full detail. But enough. The core logic. The market opportunity. The customer segment I had identified. I had talked about it the way you talk about ideas when you are excited and the room feels safe and you do not yet understand that not every room is safe. I pulled up the consulting firm's website. Claire was listed as a senior strategy consultant. I searched her name alongside my company's name. She had been listed as an external contributor on 2 internal projects in the past year. I closed the laptop. I walked to my kitchen window and stood there for a very long time looking at nothing. Because now I understood something I had not understood before. This was not just Richard making an opportunistic decision. This was not one person seeing something valuable and quietly claiming it. This was bigger than that. Project Lantern had not simply been stolen. It had been processed. Filtered through a consulting relationship, repackaged, renamed, and presented as an externally validated strategy. Which meant my company had not just used my work. They had paid someone else to put their name on it. I went back to my desk. I opened the evidence folder. And I added a new document. I titled it, Scope of Betrayal. I spent the next 4 days building that document. I did not go into the office. I told my manager I was unwell. He sent a message saying he hoped I felt better soon. I read that message 3 times. By the end of those 4 days I had something I had not expected to have when I started. I had a case. Not just an emotional grievance. Not just a feeling of injustice that I could not quite prove. A documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced case with a clear chain of events and material evidence pointing in one direction. On the 5th day I made 2 phone calls. The first was to an employment lawyer. The second was to a journalist who covered the tech industry and who had, 2 years earlier, written a piece about intellectual property disputes in the startup world that I had bookmarked at the time without knowing why. I spoke to the lawyer for 40 minutes. She asked precise questions. I answered each one. At the end she said 7 words that I had not allowed myself to hope for. She said, "You have a very strong case here." I did not celebrate. I did not cry. I simply wrote those words down in the evidence folder and closed my laptop. Because I was not finished yet. I had one more thing to verify before I was ready to move. One more piece of the picture that I needed to see clearly before I made a single move that could not be undone. I needed to know how high up this went. And what I found when I looked, I genuinely was not prepared for. This is part 2 of 3. Part 3 drops next Tuesday. The day I walked back into that building. The meeting on the 14th floor. And what I said to the 4 people sitting across that table that made every single one of them go completely silent. Subscribe. Because the ending is not what anyone expected. Not even me.